way.
Hello, everyone. Thank you and welcome to the second meeting of the Technical Code Forum for the Housing Option Study and Action Plan Strategies related to multifamily and regulated affordable housing. This is our second of 4 planned meetings. Elizabeth today is going to walk us through the code concepts, and we've provided the memo on the webpage and information as well. And just as a reminder, we'll always post any public comments we receive as well as meeting information to that page. And if there are any questions from the public or members of the forum, please don't hesitate to reach out to staff. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Elizabeth to get us started.
Great, thanks, Jackie, and thanks all of you for Daniel, Eric, and Brian for making time to be here with us today. We have some concepts as detailed in the memo that we're going to walk through, so I'll just kick us off here. Where would a planner be without a good PowerPoint? Hang on, let me get this hearing. Okay, here we go. So, we're at forum number 2 in June. Thanks to all of you for helping get this scheduled today. Just a little bit of overview and then get right into those code concepts, discussion throughout as we have been doing, and then some next steps. So as you know, we are working on implementing our state and local housing initiatives on this second part of our housing options study and action plan implementation. Since then, we have a couple additional background long-range planning things to consider, notably implementation of HB 1220, talking about range of housing needs. That's going to really factor into the 2025 County Comprehensive Plan update. So exciting time to be a planner or to be caring about housing. And so for our implementation approach, right, we're doing similar thing right now in our second batch or, phase 2 of these strategies. We've got, this is our second of the code concept forums, and then we will have some draft code language coming up at our next meetings before we move into public review and then the legislative process. So the overview of strategies that we have to discuss today, we're looking at revisiting some of the discussion around middle housing options in the medium and high density zones based on some really good discussion last month, and then allowing some residential development in mixed use and commercial zones. We talked about whether that, what kind of an opportunity that might be. And then also looking at creating more high density residential, what could be some guiding criteria for designating and rezoning some land to use for those higher density zones. So we had a question at last month's meeting about, really when we start talking about these affordable housing strategies, what do we even mean by affordable housing? There's a lot of terms that get thrown around. So I think the long and short of it is there, as you all probably know, there is not a single strategy or a single definition. It needs to be tailored for each project that we're developing in the code, defined just like any other term. But generally speaking, when we're talking about affordable housing, we're looking at housing that is affordable to households earning 80% or less of the area median income. And there's some different terms that sometimes come up in state language or local code around these income categories of extremely low, very low, or low income, right? Other terms are on workforce housing or moderate income, and that's generally higher. There can be different mixes. And then if it's, if we're talking about an affordable housing development, the definition there can also include talking about the term of availability, maybe a mix of income categories, like 100% of your units have to be affordable at 80% AMI, or only 40% if you're at 30% AMI, or different mixes there. And sometimes there are different targets set based on whether they're rental or ownership opportunities. But just for our working definition, unless otherwise specified, we're generally using affordable housing in these concepts to talk about housing that's affordable to 80% AMI or less. And with these concepts, we're going to be talking more about the commercial and mixed use zones. And so just to give us a little bit more understanding of what those opportunities are, right? The county in the study area has got these 3 different commercial zones. The most prominent, that we're going to be focusing on as primary opportunities are the community commercial and the general commercial, which is slightly higher intensity and scale of uses. Those you can see make up most of the commercial zoned acres, far more than neighborhood commercial, which is much smaller sites. And then we've also got some mixed use commercial or mixed use zone that allows for some mix of this residential and commercial uses that we're talking about. But also just to pull back and look, we start talking in a lot of these strategies about how could we get more residential into commercial. And while that is, part of the strategies that are adopted, just to pull back and remember that, yes, there is, we've talked about this very limited supply of high density residential. All of the medium and high density zones together make up only about 8% of the total buildable land. The net developable acres, according to the most recent vacant buildable lands model. And commercial is slightly larger, right? We've got 10%, but that commercial land is trying to accomplish a lot of other economic development goals. And, the way that the rest of the acreage is distributed currently in the county, of course, like the biggest amount of land, the most prominent group is that low density residential. So just so to keep in mind that it's not necessarily a trade-off of the only place to get high density residential is from commercial. There could be some opportunities in the commercial zones. We're certainly going to explore those, but that's not necessarily the only consideration or the only opportunity that we might have. All right, any questions on that before we get into some of these concepts? Okay, so talking about middle housing in the R zones, that's all the medium and high density zones. Some overall goals that we're trying to accomplish with these concepts, which were helpful for me to reframe, is thinking about trying to get this middle housing scaled, equal to these new opportunities we're proposing in the low density zones, but also maintaining a viable scale for multifamily so that middle housing doesn't become, boosted to a much higher intensity or scale than multifamily. We don't want multifamily options in these zones to really get left behind. So trying to maintain both of those goals. And then we're swimming sort of in an, if these are the egg yolks, a special double yolk, twin chicken egg here, right? They're swimming in the egg white is thinking about maintaining consistency with a comprehensive plan in terms of the purpose and scale of these overall zones. So trying to keep both those things within reason. So the first concept that I wanted to bring back was some really insightful comments you all shared at the last forum that, trying to come up with the exact right minimum lot size for every type of middle housing across these zones might be the wrong strategy, right? I was really struggling with how do we come up with the exact square footages that are right and that are fair and that achieve our scale goals and our development feasibility. And maybe the answer is to step back a little and provide more flexibility by only setting minimum lot sizes are proposed right now for single family detached and for townhouses, analogous to how they're currently regulated. But for all other types, the duplex, triplex, quadplex, and multifamily, proposing that there be no minimum lot size and that instead these new density maximums with the proposed increases for R12 and R18 would guide what scale of development could be permitted. And then you just see some other changes to the minimum density reflected here that we talked about in other strategies. So when we start thinking about this discussion, using density over lot sizes, looking to get your feedback on density, do you support this approach? Are we on the right track? If we are going to go on that track, do you want to keep the minimum lot sizes for single family detached and townhouses, or should we just open everything up and go to strictly density? And along with that, are these proposed maximum densities, in the right ballpark, manageable scale? Should we be, and then with all those changes, looking at the proposed density and the greater flexibility, taking another look back at cottages, particularly in the medium density zones, does it still seem important and feasible to retain this doubling of density in those zones for cottages? Or could we just allow housing types permitted outright with these new densities and scale? So your feedback, please.
Yeah, real quick, there's only a few of us, so if you don't
Yeah.
mind, maybe we can hit them as we go, maybe be a little
Yeah.
more efficient. The cottages, you're probably not going to need the double density, but at the same, you just won't be able to fit it. But I could see a project where you're doing some kind of commercial or some kind of multifamily, and you want to include cottages as a component. So allowing them still makes sense. I don't know that you don't need the density bonus as much. That's really more for those lower density zones, but allowing them, I think, is a good idea.
I would agree with Eric. He summed it up well. I mean, allow it just so you can have some flexibility, but I wouldn't allow double density. You've already got the focus on where you want to be at with your overall density. So just let that be the driving factor.
Yeah, and then also there could be a situation where you could actually have less density in R112 than you would on, say, R175. And so we got to look at that and how that goes, because we shouldn't have more density. We should be able to have at least the same density there. So
Yes.
R112 is one of those densities that is the middle housing that there's hardly any of out there. If I could ever find R112, it's small single family homes on 30-foot wide lots. And they're great product. Now, granted, this is more for the other one, but the design standards that are out there, the best products that I've seen to hit middle housing, to hit that price point, will no longer be allowed at those design standards. I really think we need to revisit those. And I've got some examples of homes that I actually built myself as rentals, and they're great homes. They're cost effective. I mean, the reason I did them was because they were cost effective. They rent well. They're a great value for for what you get out of it. And those design standards make those products infeasible. And they make a product feasible that actually costs more to build, that'll have less value in the end. We really need to make sure that we address that. And that's more for the other section, but these design standards really have a huge impact.
Yeah, I certainly hear what you're saying, Eric, and I just want to offer the clarification that those design standards you're talking about would not apply. I'm trying to think of a scenario that they would apply in the R zones. Those specifically apply to a compact lot development that you're doing in R1 or triplexes and quadplexes. But anyone building townhouses or single family detached outright permitted in the R zones would not trigger those design standards. So we're retaining the existing approach.
Right.
Brian, I see your hand up.
So I might be jumping the gun here, but if you're going to make the lot sizes much smaller, are you also going to adjust the lot coverage? Because that could restrict the build, what you can build on these smaller lots.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out. We haven't gotten into the lot coverage in these zones yet. Wanting to, get a preferred direction on whether we're using density or lot sizes. But yeah, as we move towards some of these lot sizes, exploring the commensurate lot coverage is going to be important as well. Thanks.
Also, look, can I ask a follow-up question? Because I don't know if I truly understood the last thing you were saying when you were responding to Eric. The design standards for cottages won't apply if you're building them as strictly as multifamily. Is that what you said?
Yeah, so Eric was asking, there's some new facade design standards proposed that limit the garage to 50% of the front facade of a building. But those only apply to the new compact lot development being proposed in R1, so not part of this package. And would apply to new triplexes and quadplexes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Brian Snodgrass.
I just have a question on process and apologize if it was in the memo and I'm just not finding it. So when this work here that we're talking about today is not part of what's already at the planning commission and it's a second phase, is there an approximate date when this work that we're talking about would go to the planning commission? And
Yeah,
council?
fall of this year. We're looking
Fall
to
of
get
this
it
year.
done,
Okay. Okay.
by October, I believe is our target.
Okay. Is I guess at what state, it's sort of a bigger question. I don't know if there's an answer for it today, but when in the timing of all these matters do you envision coming from the county any proposed actual changes of designations, rezoning essentially to comply with HB 1220? Is that a this year thing? Is that a next year thing? Do we know yet?
Yeah, I certainly would let Jackie or Susan jump in if they want, but my understanding is that this project is specifically focused on code changes to implement these strategies, and that any rezoning or redesignation is going to take place as part of the 2025 comp plan update. So that
No, understood, I guess. And if we don't have an answer yet today, that's fine. I guess part of our perspective is that the two can't be looked at entirely separately. And I know we want to finish our work now, but how one goes will influence the other. So anyway, if that's not clear at this point, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, Jackie, did you want to add anything?
No, you answered it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I really see your point, Brian, that what we propose in terms of the zoning code for these zones then affects how they can, be evaluated in terms of HB 1220. So they certainly can't be separate, but all I know is that we are not in charge of any map changes. So hopefully these changes will help move us in the direction of, sort of the overall direction we know is going to be needed for 1220. But the actual number crunching is going to have to come later. So, all right. Well, any other feedback about whether we're on the right track with this density approach, or if you want to go back and see me refine some more lot sizes for different middle housing types? Eric's shrugging. Thumbs up. Great. Okay. Dan, were you jumping on to?
Well, I know that, we've built to minimum lot sizes. I've certainly done a lot of R12, like what Eric said. It's great for that affordable sector. But I know that Gain Group has developed a 16-foot wide plan. I've seen some 18-foot wide plans that actually work pretty well. So and I think that we have a minimum lot size of 18 feet wide. Is that right? So maybe not requiring a minimum lot size if you do a subdivision, or a very small 15, 14 feet wide.
I'll jump in real quick. For what it's worth, I prefer performance-based rather than prescriptive like that. So, saying that there's a density requirement or a density goal rather than just a lot size is my preference.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many variables that are hard to predict in advance with getting, designing these square footages.
Yeah, and I even feel that with building heights. Like I prefer just giving a number of stories rather than, a prescriptive height limitation.
Great. Thanks for the feedback. All right, let's talk about the next piece. So if you go back to if you keep in mind that we're both trying to provide this, at least as much opportunity for middle housing in these medium density zones as in the low density zones, as Eric pointed to, right? That's certainly a goal. We're also trying to keep multifamily a viable development option in these zones. In part, as we've touched on just now, that we've alluded to, there's going to be these HB 1220 goals in terms of providing a whole variety of housing types specifically to meet the different distribution of income type. And so, one concern that we might have as we really increase the opportunity for these middle housing options and moving to more of a density approach, and I'm not a developer, so please correct me if I'm wrong about this assumption, but it sort of floated between some of our discussions in previous meetings, is that if we just use density in these medium density zones where we're looking at 22 units an acre or less, that there's really no differentiation between, the larger single family attached or detached and the smaller apartments, that we would generally expect market forces to favor larger units. And so concerned that there might not be as much opportunity to build multifamily in these zones. And so looking to, create additional opportunity and incentive for those smaller apartments. We've talked a lot about the need for smaller units for certain, portions of the county's population that aren't currently being housed or have a range of housing types available to them. So specifically targeting smaller units, I threw out units up to 1,000 square feet could be eligible and would get up to a 50% density bonus. I made those numbers up. They're up for discussion, but to give you an idea, and that specifically thinking this could be most applicable in the medium density zones. Once we move over to the high density zones, we would probably expect almost all housing to be these smaller units. So it's less an incentive as just if that's what everyone's already doing. So, and when I was thinking about, how this would work and does it make sense? And, how does this fit within the overall scale? I was thinking about the analogy of cottage housing, that was introduced a decade or more ago into the R1 zones as a way to specifically target smaller units with a density bonus. And so thinking, this is sort of like bringing those same parameters into the medium density zones to target an additional desired type of housing. So this really, goes beyond what is in the strategies right now from the housing options plan, but was something that could address some issues and concerns that I've heard us talking about in previous forums. But I'm very interested to get your feedback on this idea. Is this something we could continue exploring? Does it respond to any particular needs, or do you think that we've talked about so far, or there are different ways to calibrate it? And what I don't need us to spend a lot of time talking about, is it 45%? Is it 37% bonus? But, broadly speaking, are there any ways we could start talking about refining those details, particularly if there are any additional criteria for eligibility that you'd like to see considered, such, the one that of course stands out is whether it should be targeted at projects meeting certain affordability criteria. So interested in feedback.
Well, I'll start, Elizabeth. Right now, the market is such that multifamily apartment builders can really pay significantly higher values for the land than what a townhouse builder can. It just comes down to, how much it costs to build a townhouse versus how much you can get for rent out of apartment. So I don't see that there's really any need at this point to have some incentives to try and make there more density. But also I do build apartments, and I can tell you that I would like to see us ability to put in a few more studios, just because those are one of the that's one of the places where there's some affordability. So I wouldn't go as high as 1,000 square feet. 1,000 square feet, I could put a 2-bedroom, I could make a 2-bedroom apartment unit out of. So I would certainly argue that if you're going to have any kind of density, it should be fairly small, maybe like 20%, 25. And it would be if based upon the number of small units, I think we've done studios at 480 square feet. So around 500 square feet for a studio. I think that's my take of it.
Yeah, thanks.
And I know that there are already mortgage for apartment builders. There's some better mortgages available for the, and better incentives if we can keep the AMI in play, you know, at that 8% and lower. And I believe that one of the easiest ways to do that is to have studios and 1-bedroom apartments. I haven't done a whole lot of work on that. Maybe Brian could talk to that. So
Great.
Ryan, you're up.
You talk about what?
Trying to meet the incentives for hitting the AMI, you know, the 80% AMI. I think that, you know, when I had done our work on it, we looked and saw that it was the easiest way to do that was to try and do studios and 1-bedrooms, just because there's, you know, the market rents lower and it actually hits the AMI. But I don't have a whole lot of experience with that.
Yeah, the only times we've really addressed that are like in when the City of Vancouver, when we're trying to do the property tax abatement. I don't know that I've ever done. So does the county do just the county AMI, or do they do the regional one like the City of Vancouver does?
I'm not sure. that
Anyway,
the-
I haven't ever had a problem meeting those.
Yeah, well, Dan, I think your question was more about you targeting studios and 1-bedrooms specifically, and getting those to fit. Is there I don't know, a difference in terms of the mix of size of units, and how the affordability criteria apply?
Well, what we were looking at was when we put in, units, then we have X number of parking spaces that we have to do. It doesn't
Mhm.
matter if it's a studio, 1 or 2-bedroom. And I think there's only 3-bedroom. I believe there was a little bit different recreational requirements or so some of that stuff. So the number of parking units can be kind of a limiting factor, and I can get 2 studios in for pretty much a 2-bedroom house, a 2-bedroom. So
Well, that's absolutely true. Yeah, you always start with how much you can park, and that tells you how many units you can put in. Yeah, that's sort of how that
Mhm.
design process works.
All right, thanks. Eric.
I think one of the things with affordability is based on location and the type of construction. If you're trying to meet that market segment with infill development in already developed areas where you have to buy very, very expensive land, tear down existing homes, the price of the dirt alone pushes that extremely high. And also when you get over about 4 stories, the construction cost gets really significant, where you start pricing the units higher and higher, and you don't hit that market segment anymore. The most cost-effective market, or most cost-effective units, are normally like a garden style apartment that are 3 to 4 stories tall. They're stacked. They're spread out a little bit more, but they still have the density. They have lots of landscape space and amenities. And they're cheaper to build per door. Significantly cheaper to build per door than something you'd see like a mid-rise apartment complex in a developed area. And the way our zoning map's working right now in the comp plan, it's kind of leaning towards trying to do these infill things where you tear down existing homes and build mid-rises. The problem is they don't hit that market segment. They start out, the cost is too high. So to hit that segment, you really need more garden style apartments and in green fields, not necessarily in developed areas. So
I think that other thing we need to look at, Elizabeth, is 25 years ago I built a condo, but we won't build condos right now just because of the liability. And I think that a condo moving forward may be a great entry point for affordability of ownership. But nobody's going to do that right now with the liability rules. So I don't know how, I don't know how to kind of plan for that, but certainly need to look at that because, you know, 3-bedroom units would be a great thing to do with, I mean, that's what we did with our condos before.
Yeah, thanks. Brian Snodgrass.
Yeah, no, I think these are good points, Paul.
Oh, you're really quiet.
The good points all, in terms of maybe there are some incentives we can offer for condo development. The last night, our city council, as part of their MFTE discussion, multifamily tax abatement, was looking at least considering the possibility of a category of the for a tax break for condo development. So I don't know what's appropriate within this process, but I'd encourage us to see if we could find something with the local code to do that. And yeah, I guess all I'd add to the discussion is just the I think the scarcity of mid-rise and higher apartments in the VUGA, I think is well documented. And so I think we need some incentives to help make that happen. I think the market may well be there. I read about a project recently, but you know, to have it in bigger numbers, so that there's a more balanced land use menu in the VUGA. I think whatever we can do to incentivize some of that mid-rise and higher density can help.
Yeah, and also just, you know, I think we haven't hashed out these details, right? We're just exploring it right now. But when we start talking about these different styles of, you know, the gardens apartments or walk-up apartments, you know, the current ranges, right, in these medium density zones are being proposed at 18 to 22. So even if it were a 50% bonus, you know, we're looking at 27 to 33. You know, that might not support that 4-story mid-rise apartment. So, you know, just to keep in mind, if that's what we want, we might need to recalibrate, or we might need to, you know, focus on the high density zones with or without additional bonus there. But, you know, I can certainly see a range of housing types fitting into these density ranges we're talking about, not necessarily, you know, only the more intense mid-rises. Eric, did you have a follow-up? I saw you jump on.
No, I'm good.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you for talking through what that might look like. The next concept, something that comes directly out of the housing plan, talking about how affordable housing uses could be permitted outright in some of the commercial zones. And so right now, the residential uses in the 2 commercial zones, the community commercial and general commercial, only permitted in the upper stories. There is no height or density maximum, so that it can be flexible once you get up above that ground floor commercial. But the proposed strategy would be to allow, you know, affordable housing as we're going to define it, using, you know, some of either the AMI, the minimum affordability term, or other aspects of that definition, but a limited eligibility category, allowing those outright in those 2 commercial zones without the ground floor commercial use. And so the idea there is that, you know, there's not that many of these projects, so it's a fairly limited number of sites when we are responding to potential concern about, you know, opening up all of the commercial land to residential development. This would be much more focused, given that there's only so much funding and so many affordable housing projects produced per year, that, you know, that offers sort of a targeted incentive for affordable housing projects so that they're not competing on the market with market rate. And that it could also be a way to target sites that have lower commercial development potential that maybe aren't very likely to actually develop with commercial and have been stuck with that zoning for a while. And this is a way to sort of use the market and development interest to help guide those parcels to higher and better use, shall we say. City of Vancouver has one example of this that they've implemented and seen applied. So that's part of the inspiration here. But talking through how we refine the strategy, curious if there should, if there's interest in any additional locational requirements, such as whether the sites are in proximity to transit, or if we should leave it fairly open so that, you know, it can really just be about site availability and individual site analysis. Thinking about, you know, if there is no ground floor commercial use requirement, should there be any alternative ground floor design standards? So that could, you know, apply to those residential uses, things like more on the scale. So thinking about ground floor height or window coverage, entrance, plaza, those types of requirements. If that could help maintain compatibility in commercial areas. And, you know, as mentioned, there's no height or density. Right now, there are setbacks, some step backs from residential zones and some landscaping, but you know, if we explore permitting this affordable housing outright, should there be any additional development standards introduced? So feedback on this concept.
There's always that challenge, I think, of making sure we still meet the jobs land. And, you know, we're always trying to convert, or not, but we have clients that are always trying to convert commercial property to residential, because that's where the market is right now.
Yeah.
Instead, the zoning might need to follow that. We might need to zone more things commercial or residential than commercial. But we still do need to make sure that we have commercial in the right places, and a lot of times we don't. And that's why we end up wanting to rezone those, and it's almost impossible to do. So you end up building some kind of a mixed use that those units tend to be pretty expensive. But I don't know, it's maybe looking closer to zoning map. There's a lot of commercial land out there that is not viable commercial because it's not right along a traveled way, or there's access issues. So just more, it's got something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Sir.
So I've built a couple of projects and on community commercial, and I believe we were the first one to do that in the city of Vancouver. We were kind of the pilot project, and it was very intentional. The city offered to rezone that to multifamily. It was very intentional that we did not rezone that to multifamily, and rather that we asked for the variance in the commercial code, specifically because it has more leniency with regard to density, height, and parking. So I don't think I'd want more multifamily. I'd want the flexibility that the commercial code offers. And certainly the pieces of land that we're looking at were not prime commercial land, either because they weren't right on the major thoroughfares, or if they were on the major thoroughfares, they had challenges like right in, right out only, or the lots were small. They were really, they were not great commercial sites. And I believe that, you know, in the age of Amazon, we're overzoned with commercial. But again, I don't want to change the commercial code. I want the variance to be able to do housing without the ground floor requirement. And not to get overly political, but with regard to the arguments of lands for jobs, I think we'd probably be better off reevaluating how much prime land we devote to warehousing and the number of jobs that creates, versus worrying about whether some affordable housing burns up commercial land. So I think it's fantastic, and
Yeah.
I like the leniency that it offers, but granted, I'm an affordable housing developer, and I do structure my deals to take advantage of subsidy sources also.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Brian.
Yeah, I would just echo that from the city's end, that one of the benefits that we're seeing. Microphone. One of the benefits keep forgetting, benefits we're seeing is that the number of affordable housing providers is limited, and even if we had quite a bit more of them taking advantage of this provision in our code, it wouldn't make that much difference in citywide total commercial supplies. we're also seeing, and we need to develop this as part of our comprehensive plan, but that at least in theoretical aggregate, we may be over retailed. There was a rezone that the county council considered today where that was the basic argument that that in the VUGA and the Battleground and Ridgefield areas that there's too much. So I don't know if, you know, I haven't read it. I don't know if we would agree with it, but I think there's some evidence out there that we've got ample land for these. And by allowing the, as you said, Elizabeth, by allowing it in commercial zones, the affordable housing does not have to compete with multifamily housing developers, which is tough competition right now. So.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Any other thoughts as we move forward with how we could implement this? All right, thanks. We can always come back, but I'll just keep us moving here. So next we move to, you know, sort of thinking more broadly about those commercial and mixed use zones for all types of residential, not just affordable housing, thinking about how we could enhance the feasibility of residential there. So there's some adjustments that we came up with as part of the housing plan as a starting point for this strategy. So some of those could include any mix of the following or other strategies, looking at whether there are additional residential uses that could be permitted outright in those zones. Maybe that's, I think we heard workforce housing being mentioned to meet that 80 to 120% AMI. Looking at reducing, if not, you know, rather than eliminating the ground floor commercial use requirement. Maybe there's a storefront right on the corner, or it's, you know, half of the ground floor or some other percentage, but not the entire ground floor. Ways we could consider active ground floor use areas. So things like lobbies or gyms or pedestrian plazas that still create sort of that buzz and interaction and you know, similar form as a commercial use, but serve the residential use instead. And then sort of borrowing a page from the existing mixed use standards. Right now, the commercial code or the commercial zoning standards say it has to be vertical mixed use. It has to be residential over commercial. But could we instead introduce an option in the commercial zones that it can be horizontal, so that there could be separate commercial and residential uses on the same parcel, so that the residential portion of the project could be more of a standalone ground floor up, and then freestanding commercial that you know, might be built by a separate developer or might have, you know, different structural needs, be oriented a little differently as a different way to get that mix on the same parcel and meet, you know, as we talked about, some of these economic development goals as well as the residential goals. So when we think about whether any of those could be viable, which of those we might move forward with in the code, you know, generally, do you see opportunities to expand residential uses in the commercial zone? As has come up already, you know, there are sort of the alternative strategy is really just to increase the amount of residential zoning that we have in the county, and that's going to be certainly on the table as part of the comprehensive plan coming up. But right now we have this opportunity to expand some residential uses in commercial, if that seems viable. And if so, you know, which of these strategies or which other strategies would you like to see developed further? Or potentially could some of these be borrowed from the mixed use standards? But then, you know, looking at those mixed use standards, you know, how are those working? Are those actually a viable model that we want to even consider borrowing from? And are there any adjustments there that could better support residential? Cyril.
So as we think about this, I'm just throwing this out there. I don't know if it's been addressed, but if we do housing in these commercial and mixed use zones, it'd be great to have some sort of parking variance, right? Because parking is often the tail that wags the dog. And if you've got certain zones that there could be shared parking where the commercial piece uses it during the day and the residential piece uses it at night, to give people flexibility and the number of spaces they're required to put in, which would certainly boost the density you could build.
Great. Yeah, other ideas?
There's definitely some changes that need to be done to the current MX standards. The current MX code has got issues around. I believe the townhouse portion is kind of a mess, and there's a bunch of work that needs to be done with the MX residential portion.
Mhm.
I know that Deeb's talked about that a little bit in the past.
Okay, thanks. What about feasibility of having horizontal mixed use rather than vertical mixed use in the commercial zones? Any reactions from the group about interest and or cautions there?
No, I think that that's something that certainly could be looked at. I mean, I did a plan unit development. Eric actually did the planning for it out in Battleground, to where I had mixed density around, basically because there was a wetland in the middle of it. I just matched the residential areas next to it, so it worked really well.
Mhm.
And I like what Cirque said about being able to have some kind of variance when you mix commercial and residential, because the parking limitation is the big one, and you should be able to have those parking uses timed it differently.
Yes, right. Nobody's going to the bank at 2 a.m. All right. Any other group thoughts on these strategies? Okay, well, then our last criteria for today, or our last concept for today, is really thinking about, I struggle with this one, I'll admit. So it's thinking about the criteria for zoning high density residential land. So, you know, as has already come up, we're not talking about changing the maps as part of this process. What could be part of our strategies and our implementation code package that moves forward with these is changing some of the criteria in the zoning code for how lands get designated and zoned for high density residential. And this could really apply to two different sets of scenarios, or two different scenarios, right? One, we talk about converting low density residential land, upzoning it to higher density residential, but also, you know, we've talked about commercial. Do we change the standards in commercial, or do we just, you know, try to develop some criteria about what commercial lands are suitable for rezoning to high density residential outright? So those are sort of the two places where there could be some changing, and our opportunity is to think about the criteria under which those could change. And, you know, as I went through the code and really thought about, you know, what can we put in the code that could help guide this, you know, versus what discussions need to happen as part of the comprehensive plan update. There's really two main opportunities. And, you know, the first is we could look at the purpose statements for these residential zones, because the purpose statements, you know, one of the criteria for rezoning and redesignating is, you know, are you meeting the purpose statement of the zone? So if we wrote those to be more detailed about the intended role for the zone and what kinds of sites are suitable for medium and high density residential, possibly differentiating between them, that could have, you know, not a huge impact, but would help guide the process, you know, provide some additional guidance on that rezoning and redesignation process. And we could also look at in the county code, there's a chapter about, you know, making changes to the comprehensive plan map and what the approval criteria are. There's general criteria, but there also are some specific approval criteria, you know, if you're moving into certain uses, and, you know, given the importance of additional residential uses, particularly these higher density ones, we could look at adding, you know, some specific approval criteria for any rezone to, or redesignation and rezone to the urban medium and urban high plan designations. And so that could also address similar things. And maybe that aspect of it is a little wonky, but just to like, what can we actually do with this strategy? It's changing some criteria. It's not directly applying to any parcels at this time. And I think to consider this, we need to zoom out a little bit to the context and really, ask a broader question about what's come up in some of our other discussions so far, just like really, where should higher density residential areas be sited? Are some of these areas that are commercial, would they actually be better suited based on, some of these factors are addressed in the code already, talking about the proximity to streets and transit, of course, adequacy of sewer and water are going to be big ones. Talking about proximity to commercial services or open space, recreational opportunities. Generally, I guess the idea is, the closer you are to those things, the more people could live there. And then sort of a compatibility with adjacent uses, which, certainly has an undertone, one aspect of that is thinking about both how it transitions to more intense uses, such as commercial uses, but also how it might transition to low density residential uses. And so managing all of those transitions. When you think about the zoning map, and I thought about it was difficult to put on a slide to capture this area at any level of detail, but the main arterials and the freeways, right, in our study area have commercial zoning right along them. Most of the highest density residential is then next to the commercial, and then it sort of steps down in terms of intensity. And that's fairly consistent with, this is a classic transect for more form-based codes, but, this idea that you go from less intense to more intense uses. And in the case of the current code and the current map, you're really using the highest capacity transportation and transit facilities as the most intense uses aligned along those and stepping down from there. So, that's as an overarching principle of where to and how to apply land uses, that seems, generally to make sense. But, here's our opportunity to talk more about that. Is it, first of all, is it a promising strategy to look at changing some of these code criteria that I pointed to? And do you think that this transect model, this idea of stepping down intensity away, as you move away from the highest intensity facilities, does that make sense? Or are there any other sort of guiding criteria or priority locations where these higher density residential uses and zones could be appropriate? Eric.
Can you go back to that last slide?
Yes.
Okay, so two things, but not even talking about this slide yet, but I like the idea of some better criteria for rezoning, because right now it's very difficult to take land that's not viable and it's commercial or some other use and convert it to residential. It's an uphill battle. You spend a lot of money and it's a crapshoot. So having some better guidance, and some of that guidance is a lot of times it's access. It's access, and that you have stuff behind something else that just is not really viable commercial property. And then ironically, you'll have something zoned like mixed use up in front of it. So, swap them might be even a better way to go, but usually it's multiple property owners, so it doesn't work. And then we have another issue in Clark County, and it's because we're developing and because we've tried to plan. And what happens is that we end up leapfrogging some of these zones, and we end up putting more density outside. So one issue we have right now is probably between, I would say, T4 and T3. Okay, between there somehow, we've gapped in T2 or T1 because we have all these agriculture or resource zone lands right on the fringe of the current urban growth boundary. And those have been very difficult to convert and to change to what they should be, which is basically the new suburban areas. And then what happens is we start moving to get the same density. We have to either make it even more dense inside than is viable or cost effective, or we have to leapfrog over those areas. We have to extend urban services. We have to, keep going and then put suburban density outside of these ag lands. And it has more environmental impact. It has more sprawl, more traffic. All these things have a negative impact. And because we tried to plan and we thought those areas would always be ag and we'd never catch up to them, that didn't happen. We didn't plan far enough ahead. And we didn't think that we couldn't change them later, which was the real issue. So I thought, when we get to those, we redesignate those as urban development, we move ag land further out. Well, when you have this process where you can't move that once it's designated,
Mhm.
we got a problem. And it's very difficult to leapfrog over those areas with the urban services necessary. So I don't know how we address that in this. It might just be a note or a comment. It's a bigger problem, but it's something that the county does have to address eventually.
Yeah, thanks, Eric.
I believe, Elizabeth, that the city of Vancouver has something in their code that you might be able to steal, so you might be able to look at that. I know, what we look for in the multifamily on a lot of the townhouse developments that we've done is we've had a lot of success, and it seems like they've had some planning around open spaces, so parks or schools, and schools usually got play facilities next to them. That area located right next to those has been, medium density housing.
Mhm.
And I've seen some locations to where that wasn't the case, and that may be a good opportunity to have that transition away from that higher intense use next to a park or a schoolyard.
Okay, thanks. Brian?
This is good discussion. I would caution us getting too far ahead on this, this particular thing, because there's going to have to be in the VUGA, as there is in the city of Vancouver and everywhere else, a hard look at potential rezoning coming up in the next year. And so that's going to inform this kind of thing. So I wouldn't want to get too far ahead on this advisory group coming up with criteria, and then when the county staff or in the city staff is actually looking for rezone opportunities for the jurisdictions to do, to then somebody say, well, if this isn't consistent with the criteria. I think a lot of planning, I mean, this is a broad statement, a lot of planning is as tactile as is strategic also. And so, for instance, we still have, I'm hoping they go away in this comprehensive plan update or get down, but we still have purpose statements for our zones, and they do serve a purpose. But I think if they were sort of designed in an ideal world as if you're sort of blank slate filling stuff in. So I would not want to spend a whole lot of time on purpose statements right now. I mean, maybe towards the end of this comp plan update. The one thing I think we could offer or could talk about it that I would hope would be a criteria would be affordable housing. That not that an affordable housing rezone automatically gets approved, but it has a leg up. We do a lot of planning in terms of targeting specific densities and so on, and some of that's in the hopes that it results in affordable housing. Let's have the number be the criteria of, or the affordability of the projects. Let that be a big driver as well. So.
Yeah, I agree, Brian, that it, I think I said I struggle with this strategy the most because it's a little more nebulous in terms of what it would actually affect, and does it really make sense to list out, in an ideal world, here's where you would put these zones, when we all know we're planning for this world.
Yeah, and that we're going to know more, and we'll know a lot more in 6 months or a year.
Right. So I think it's less about, can we don't want to create anything that's going to box the county or the cities in. It's more like, is there anything we could do now that would, be helpful in informing that discussion? And it could be from my perspective, this could be a very light touch on this strategy, but it was in the package of implementation. And so here we are considering it. Okay, well, I have just one last follow-up here before we turn it over to sort of open discussion and question is, and we've got a few folks on the call that can help out with this, but last meeting, we were talking about changes to the recreation space standards for multifamily. And one of the insightful comments from this group was that, the real concern these days was that there was differing interpretations of how those recreation area requirements and the site landscaping and the setback standards overlapped or were separate. And so Brian Mattson, I'll let you jump in here in a second. You know, if you want to offer any clarifications, but, you know, as I understand, there's a section in the code that we were specifically talking about last month about these open space and recreational areas, and that's a square footage per unit that's required. But there are also overall site landscaping requirements that I believe is 20% for most of those R zones. And that as part of that landscaping, there is specific landscaping setbacks and buffers depending on the adjacent uses. And so the question is, should these, you know, do these overlap, or are they all separate categories that must be met individually? And if they're all separate, then that really raises some concerns about how much of the total site is being, you know, devoted to these types of uses rather than housing, you know, actual buildings and units, not to mention the parking, which, as we discussed, is a big space hog. And so it sounds like this has changed a lot in the last year, or over the course of the last year, of how this has been interpreted. And that, you know, part of our work moving forward will be to make some recommendations about how these things work together, so that it is clearer and it's more feasible to, you know, meet landscaping and open space goals as well as housing goals. So Brian, do you want to add anything about sort of what these numbers are? I didn't dwell a lot on the specifics because
I can.
Yeah.
Long story short, the staff's current direction is that they are to be met separately and that they can't overlap. Now, there's been a lot of talk and proposals to allow them to not be mutually exclusive, right? And if something complies with the type 1 landscaping and it complies with the recreation space, that we should count it towards both. There was an emergency ordinance. That emergency ordinance was suspended by a referendum action from the public. Then that referendum suspension ran out, and then it was eligible to be counted for both standards for like about a month, and then that expired. So currently we're back to not allowing them to be counted towards both standards. Now I get it. These are both space eaters, right? That's contrary to higher density. I don't know if they're going to want to adopt allowing those to be counted towards both standards in order to free up more land for development or not. But certainly something that could be proposed. I know Eric's familiar with this issue. He loves this issue. So he may have some additional insight.
Yeah, sure. Any other comments you wanted to offer, Eric?
Yeah, so this was a interpretation issue, and it was interpreted the same way for over 20 years since I've been doing projects in Clark County. And it is every project prior to like probably 2 years ago when someone made this interpretation that varied, were under the other interpretation that basically said, yes, you need to have a certain amount of your site landscaped. And that's basically, you know, not paved or building. And that's a separate code section altogether. And then you have a section that had a different intent, which says you need to provide a certain amount of recreation space. And some of that recreation space could be used in landscaping. Some of it could be used inside the building. Some of it could be used like a pool area, things like that. There were other uses, but it was never that anything that was landscaped could not also be considered, because landscaping was more like a lot coverage. It was about what was green versus what was hard surface. You can have landscaped areas that's also recreation space. And it was interpreted that way for over 20 years. Now, there was interpretation made by one of the planners that I think is not even here anymore at the county. And it kind of brought this up. And when you look at the actual language of the code, it's unclear. It is unclear because it doesn't say that you can or you can't. It doesn't say whether it should be like counted or it shouldn't be. So there was an interpretation or a decision made that basically said they have to go with the most restrictive requirement, which is you have to meet them independently. Now, a lot of projects are no longer feasible. There's projects that can no longer even meet the density in the comp plan effectively. And it has a significant impact. We should fix that. And I feel strongly that it should be fixed to be the same as the initial intent and the interpretation for over 20 years. And I don't think staff really disagreed with it. What happened was the public got involved and they just saw it as, we want more green space. This is a change in policy. It was never a change in policy. It was a clarification of some poorly written code language from before. And I'm not saying staff didn't interpret it correctly. They actually agreed with it and then moved it forward. But the process it went through got very convoluted, and then it just got in a tailspin and it got blown out of proportion, where the projects that are really impacted the most by this are not a lot of the ones that we do for private developers. It's the ones that are either infill development where you don't have a lot of green space to provide that area, or it is low income housing that we're trying to address with these codes, trying to keep the costs down and trying to keep the rents low. On garden style apartments, we do quite a few of those. Really easy to meet those requirements. We have plenty of green space and they're affordable. We're not adding that kind of land to the comp plan anymore. So we have to be more creative, and these are very restrictive and they keep projects from happening and they make them not cost effective. So yes, I think it's very important that we address it and we get it fixed.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Daniel?
I think Brian started out real well in that our goal is to be more dense. If you get more dense, it's going to be more and more restrictive, and it becomes more and more expensive if you're going to end up wasting a bunch of space, you know, that could have been used either way. So I would say that we should try and figure out a way to make it clear that they're overlapping requirements.
Great.
Hey, Elizabeth, I just wanted to add one more thing. To Eric's point, I do think that this issue has been misunderstood by some of the people that are the most vocal about it. Contextually, it's been just boiled down to a lack of open space, but it's much more intricate than that. It doesn't result in the same thing that would purport.
I would just add as well that there are other areas in the code as well that deal with similar, like the Highway 99 overlay zone also requires a 10% internal open space. And it's not at all clear in that whether that has to be counted separately from other open areas as well. You know, when you start having overlay zones and other requirements, they have a tendency to just keep adding up.
Yeah. Right. I noticed, you know, the cottages require open space, and there's nothing there that says how that relates, you know, to other requirements in the code. So it isn't clear. Sarek.
I just want to say that I agree with every single thing Eric said, including the public participation piece, which I think I'm not sure it was unintentional on the public participation side. I think it may have been very intentional to keep open space. And if the goal, whether it's our goal to just make the community affordable for everyone, or whether it gets handed down by, you know, HB 1220, if the goal is density, not having these uses overlap, it's kind of like the parking thing I brought up earlier. It just doesn't make any sense not to have open space requirements and recreational requirements overlap. So I'm just reiterating what's being said, but I think it's important.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I'm going to turn this over to open discussion. If there's anything, any ideas or questions that we haven't talked about so far, any other observations, things you want to make sure that we're all considering before I'm going to start working to convert these concepts into some initial draft code language sections at our next meeting. Daniel, is that your hand up?
Yeah, I did have a question.
Yeah.
Where in our ideas, or where in the ideas would there be a discussion around like RV parks or some kind of small safe space housing? Because I think that you know, the city of Vancouver's looked at some of that, and I know that you know, there's some other communities that have looked at some of those different things, and I don't know if, I know that our code right now, it's trying to do an RV park that's very, very restrictive where it's located at, so I don't, that's just do we need to have that discussion, or is that something that's is that something that comes through the middle housing, affordable housing options, or is that something that comes through from the county commissioners?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. That is partially addressed. We talked about RV parks in one of the other plan strategies, but it is not one of the strategies that was prioritized for this batch of code implementation in the first year. So I think there was first a study of some, analysis the county was going to do about the existing parks and standards, and then any changes would come after that. But long way of saying it's not something that we are charged with considering in these code updates.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I thought I saw some other hands, but anyone else? I mean, feel free to jump in.
I did have my hand up, but then I put it
Thanks.
down. But sorry. I want to clarify. I think that our current understanding, or at least our current definition of RV parks, is not permanent housing, right? They have to leave like every 90 days or something like that. And so maybe that contributes to why this isn't part of this strategy. Or maybe we're not defining it correctly. Maybe a different definition would be in order. But I'll let you guys lead that discussion.
Yeah, and Elizabeth was right. Like there's some additional strategies about RVs, and they were designated as, I think, medium or long-term. So they just need a little bit more analysis and work. But feel free to go check out the housing option study as they're listed in there. So once staff completes this round, we'll be going back to council to get direction on the next round of strategies that they're interested in looking at. So more to come on that.
All right. So yes, I mean, there's always more to come. So thank you for all of your feedback on the concepts today and from our previous meeting. So we'll be taking that and, any follow-up questions with staff and whatnot, to help inform some initial code writing. We're looking probably to have, meeting number 3 in July. I'm not quite sure about the schedule for the 4th one, but we'll be in touch to find a time that works in July. And then to schedule the subsequent meeting. We know that, summer vacations are starting, so we'll do our best to work with everyone. And then also just wanted to give you an update, been referenced a couple times here, that we do have that first batch of code updates that we worked on through the first series of forums that are really moving through the adoption process. We've just had our second work session with Planning Commission, and the public hearing is coming up on June 15th. And I believe a number of you are already, aware of and or involved in that. But if anyone else wants to keep up to date on that, all the materials are posted on the Jackie, are they on the project website, the Planning Commission website at this point? But the hearing's ready code language as proposed is available, and we'd welcome your participation if there's anything you'd like to share with the commission at their hearing. All right, well, that's enough from me then.
And we
Well,
do
thank you,
have
Elizabeth.
those comments from Deeb on the previous batch, and we'll forward those to you as soon as we get finalized from Deeb. So
Great.
Great.
but we tried to be as specific as possible and give some justification as well. So hopefully, if you have any questions though, please reach out. It'd be nice to see some of these maybe incorporated before it goes to council. If there's stuff that we can agree on, it really saves a lot of turmoil at the public hearing with council. We'd love to go in saying, hey, we agree with them. We had some concerns. Staff and the group looked at it and made some revisions, and this is the revised one, and these are the changes that were made. It'd be great to do that, instead of trying to, throw things out at the hearing. So I guess I encourage people to let's try to do stuff in advance so we're not scrambling. So we want to be, we don't want to drop anything on you that you don't expect, and hopefully we can get it resolved before. So, and I
Yeah,
can tell you the
writing
biggest
code
one's the design
in the
standards.
hearing is awful.
It is. Yep. It's going to get delayed. What'll happen? I mean, it's been very predictable with what council does when they see stuff like this. If there's a lot, it just gets continued, and we all waste a lot more time. So I guess I encourage, let's try to work together on some of these. And, the biggest ones, some of them are just like intent things or unintended consequences that we kind of identified. The biggest policy decision is really in those design standards. And I can tell you some of the most efficient home products that we've seen over the last probably 15 years that have addressed middle housing would no longer be allowed under those housing standards. And instead, we're forced to build stuff that's less efficient, has more impact on the neighbors because of parking. If we're limiting a garage and a driveway to 10 feet wide for those products, one, they're not ADA accessible. You can't even get a wheelchair past them. You can't unload in your garage. And you have cars parked, and then you got to put the cars somewhere else. You can do offsite parking. That eliminates a unit, makes the other units more higher. It drives the cost of those units up, and it's personal preference. I mean, some people, if they want a 1-car garage and they prefer the look of that, I really don't want to necessarily codify aesthetics. And there are certain things, I guess, to like make sure you don't have this cookie cutter where all the facades are the same, but it can be done in a much more efficient manner. You could have basically, I think the City of Vancouver has done stuff like that. City of Ridgefield has, where you can't have the exact same facade within 3 homes. And it's not hard to do. I can show you an example. And, parking, people really want, especially when the house gets smaller, they need more storage. Otherwise, it gets put out in the front yard. It starts being a dump. I can show you examples of communities that have worked that would not meet those design standards. So that's probably the biggest one. If you guys want to kind of, consider that before it goes to hearing, and we'll send you some examples as well.
Yeah, sure. We'll look for that. And appreciate, likewise that, the more that we hear in advance, the more we can have these conversations and try to work things out and be prepared, and yeah, just help planning commission, make the best decisions. So we're given them materials. And I agree. We also don't want to see it delayed or see that sloppy code writing by committee. It's just not pleasant. So great. All right. Well, here we are. I guess we're gonna let you go early. So enjoy your extra found time. And thanks for participating today. Really appreciate
Thanks,
it.
everyone.
Thank you.